Picture this for a second. What if everything you thought you knew about the deepest teachings of Jesus was just incomplete? What if there were secret words, hidden revelations, deliberately scrubbed from the texts we read today? And what if I told you there's an ancient document, the Gospel of Thomas, packed with sayings from Jesus so revolutionary, they rattled the very foundations of early Christianity? This ain't just another dusty old religious scroll lost to time. It's a treasure trove of wisdom that's been lurking in the shadows for nearly 2 millennia, just waiting for the perfect moment to bust out and hit the world again. The Gospel of Thomas isn't some epic narrative like the canonical Gospels we're familiar with. Nah, this is a raw, straight-up collection of 114 sayings attributed to Jesus himself. No fancy storytelling, no miracle accounts, no political or social context to distract from the core message. Every single word is designed to cut straight to the heart of the spiritual seeker, like laser-guided missiles piercing through layers of religious conditioning we've piled up over centuries. These aren't teachings for the masses, folks. These are precise instructions for those truly ready to wake up to a deeper reality. What makes this gospel so extraordinary, and let's be real, so damn controversial, is that it paints a picture of Jesus that many consider radically different from the traditional image. Here, we find a teacher who talks about inner divinity, about the kingdom of heaven as a state of consciousness present in every moment, about the need to ditch the dualities that keep us trapped in illusion. These are teachings that resonate deep with mystical traditions from all corners of the globe, suggesting that universal spiritual wisdom found one of its clearest, most direct spokesmen in Jesus. But here's the question that keeps us up at night. Why did this text stay hidden for so long? What forces conspired to keep these words out of the public eye? And what does its rediscovery mean for how we understand Christianity and spirituality in general? The answers to those questions will take us on a wild ride through the earliest centuries of Christianity, when different schools of thought were duking it out, trying to define what it really meant to follow Jesus' teachings. The story of the Gospel of Thomas is a mystery in itself, worthy of the best archaeological thrillers. For centuries, this text only existed in fragmented references within the writings of early church fathers, who mostly brought it up just to condemn it as heresy. It was like a ghost in the library of Christian history, a presence everyone knew had been there, but nobody could actually touch or examine directly. Everything changed dramatically in 1945. Picture this: a local Egyptian farmer, Muhammad Ali Salman, stumbles upon one of the most significant archaeological finds of the 20th century. Near the village of Nag Hammadi, up in Upper Egypt, this guy was just digging for natural fertilizer for his crops when his hoe hit something hard buried in the sand. What he unearthed was a big sealed ceramic jar, and inside it, a whole library of early Christian texts that had been hidden away for over 1,500 years. Among those manuscripts, written in Coptic, was a complete copy of the Gospel of Thomas. Imagine the moment when the first scholars finally got to read these words that had been whispered in secret among the earliest Christian communities. Teachings preserved by folks who risked everything to keep alive a spiritual tradition they considered too precious to ever lose. The importance of this find can't be overstated. For the first time in modern history, we had direct access to a document that let us hear a different voice from early Christianity, a voice that had been silenced by the later developments of Christian orthodoxy. It was like a window open to the past, giving us a totally fresh perspective on Jesus' original teachings and on the incredible diversity that marked the first few centuries of the Christian movement. Specialists immediately started poring over this text with the intensity of spiritual detectives, hunting for clues about its origins, its dating, and its connection to the canonical Gospels. What they found was even more mind-blowing than they'd imagined. Evidence suggested that some of the teachings preserved in the Gospel of Thomas might be as old as, or even older than, the material used in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. If you want to truly grasp the magnitude of what we're digging into here, I need you to hit that subscribe button right now. Seriously, smash it. Because what we're about to uncover together in the next few minutes is going to permanently shift your perspective on spirituality and on the deepest teachings humanity has ever received. This isn't the kind of content you just stumble upon. Every video I drop is another piece of a fascinating puzzle we're putting together. The content of the Gospel of Thomas is genuinely revolutionary in its simplicity and depth. It kicks off with a statement that immediately sets its esoteric tone. These are the secret words which the living Jesus spoke and which Didymos Judas Thomas wrote. The word secret here doesn't necessarily mean deliberate concealment. It's more about teachings that demand a particular level of readiness and understanding to truly get. One of the most striking features of this gospel is its laser focus on direct experience of the divine. While a lot of religious traditions emphasize belief in specific dogmas or sticking to particular ritual practices, the Gospel of Thomas seems to constantly point towards the possibility of an immediate personal experience of spiritual reality. Jesus talks repeatedly about the kingdom, but not as a place you go after you die. Nope. He talks about it as a present condition that can be recognized and experienced right here, right now. One of the deepest teachings we find here is the idea that every human being carries a divine spark inside, a seed of the same stuff the kingdom of heaven is made of. This isn't some flowery poetic metaphor. It's a direct description of spiritual reality as Jesus perceived it. The spiritual path, according to this text, isn't about becoming something you're not, but about recognizing and actualizing what you already are at your deepest core. This brings us to one of the most fascinating aspects of the Gospel of Thomas, its presentation of teachings that seem to point towards a form of spiritual non-duality. Jesus talks about transcending the divisions between inner and outer, male and female, up and down. He's not pushing some abstract intellectual philosophy. He's pointing towards a state of consciousness where these apparent divisions are revealed as illusions that cloud our perception of the fundamental unity of all existence. The most revolutionary aspect of these teachings lies in their completely different approach to salvation and spiritual enlightenment. While later interpretations of Christianity cooked up elaborate doctrines about original sin, vicarious atonement, and the need for institutional intermediaries to achieve salvation, the Gospel of Thomas presents a radically direct path. Jesus isn't presented here as the only Son of God destined to die for humanity's sins. He's more like an elder brother who has already walked the path that we all can tread. His words don't establish a new religion with its dogmas and authority structures. Instead, they point towards the possibility for each individual to awaken to their own divine nature. Modern academic research has unearthed fascinating patterns in the language used in this gospel. Experts in Semitic languages have noted that many of the expressions preserved here retain characteristics that suggest a very early transmission of the original teachings. The use of parallels, paradoxes, and seemingly contradictory statements isn't some theological confusion. It's a sophisticated teaching method designed to push the student beyond ordinary conceptual thinking towards a more direct, intuitive form of understanding. One of the most notable features of this text is how it handles the concept of time. Jesus repeatedly talks about a state where past and future are revealed as mental constructs that keep us separated from present reality. The kingdom isn't something that will come in the future, nor something that existed in the past. It's the eternal condition that's always available in the present moment for those who have eyes to see. This radical temporal perspective has profound implications for understanding the nature of spiritual experience and the process of inner transformation. Comparative studies have shown that this gospel shares significant elements with wisdom traditions that were floating around the Mediterranean world in the early centuries. However, what makes it unique isn't so much the individual elements it contains, but the particular way these elements combine to create a coherent system of spiritual teaching. The influence of Gnostic thought is evident, but the Gospel of Thomas isn't just another Gnostic text. It represents a specific synthesis that maintains a delicate balance between the Gnostic emphasis on direct knowledge and a practical, accessible spirituality. The social context in which these teachings originally circulated was incredibly diverse and dynamic. Early Christian communities weren't monolithic entities with uniform beliefs. They were complex networks of groups holding widely varied theological perspectives and spiritual practices. The Gospel of Thomas likely circulated among communities that valued direct mystical experience and saw Jesus not so much as an object of worship, but as a guide and example of what's possible for any human being seriously committed to spiritual development. One of the most captivating dimensions of this text is its take on the relationship between knowledge and transformation. This isn't just about picking up info about spiritual reality. It's about a kind of knowledge that's inseparable from a fundamental shift in one's way of being. Jesus' words here aren't designed to be believed or memorized, but to be experienced and verified through direct spiritual practice. This empirical approach to spirituality was revolutionary in its time and remains radical in ours. The symbolism used in the Gospel of Thomas operates on multiple levels simultaneously. Specialists have identified layers of meaning ranging from references to specific meditation practices to coded descriptions of particular states of consciousness. The references to light, for instance, aren't merely poetic metaphors. They're precise indications about the nature of the inner experience that emerges when the mind quiets and the heart opens to more subtle dimensions of reality. The oral tradition that preceded the written fixation of these teachings likely included elements of initiatic transmission that can't be fully captured in text. Researchers have noted that many of the Gospel's most enigmatic statements make sense when understood as clues or signals pointing towards specific experiences that must be cultivated through practice. This experiential dimension explains why these teachings were considered secret, not because of some exclusive esoteric doctrine, but because their true meaning is only revealed through personal commitment to the spiritual path they describe. The implications of these teachings for understanding the nature of reality are profound. The Gospel of Thomas suggests that what we normally perceive as the solid, separate world of physical objects is actually a projection of conditioned mental patterns. Spiritual liberation isn't about escaping this world to some other realm, but about seeing through the perceptual illusions that keep us trapped in patterns of suffering and separation. This perspective has surprising parallels with later developments in quantum physics and neurosciences, though it obviously uses a very different language and conceptual framework. The historical foundations of these teachings stretch back to a time of extraordinary spiritual ferment in the Mediterranean world. During the first centuries of our era, multiple currents of religious and philosophical thought converged in territories that had been Hellenized by Alexander the Great's conquests, but still held much older spiritual traditions. The context in which these secret words of Jesus emerged was that of a deeply syncretic culture, where Jewish, Greek, Egyptian, and Persian traditions influenced each other in complex and often subtle ways. The Nag Hammadi library, where the Gospel of Thomas was discovered in 45, represents just a fraction of what must have been a much wider literary and spiritual tradition. Researchers have identified connections between these texts and traditions that stretched from Mesopotamia all the way to India, suggesting that the teachings preserved in this gospel were part of an international network of spiritual exchange that operated via trade routes and learning centers scattered across the known world. This cosmopolitan dimension helps explain why Jesus' teachings in this text resonate with principles found in traditions seemingly far apart geographically and culturally. If you decide to subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell, you'll get access to ongoing research that digs into these fascinating connections between different ancient spiritual traditions. Every video I drop goes deeper into specific aspects of these archaeological and textual discoveries that are revolutionizing our understanding of Christianity's origins and its relationship to other spiritual currents of antiquity. The process of transmitting these teachings reveals crucial aspects of how spiritual knowledge was preserved in the ancient world. Unlike the texts that eventually made it into the New Testament canon, the teachings of the Gospel of Thomas seem to have been primarily passed down through lineages of teachers and disciples who committed to practicing these principles in their daily lives. This form of experiential transmission meant that the deep meaning of these words couldn't be accessed just by intellectual study. It required a kind of inner maturation that could only develop through time and spiritual discipline. The most radical elements of these teachings focus on claims about the nature of human identity that challenged both traditional Jewish concepts and dominant Greek philosophies. When Jesus talks about those who drink from his mouth becoming like him, he's not making an exclusive claim of divinity. He's describing a spiritual potential inherent in all human beings. This perspective represents a radical democratization of the spiritual experience, stripping away the need for institutional mediators and putting the responsibility for spiritual development directly into the individual's hands. The psychological sophistication of these teachings becomes evident when you examine the specific techniques they describe for working with the mental and emotional patterns that keep people stuck in states of suffering and confusion. The Gospel's most enigmatic logion often turn out to be precise descriptions of psychological processes that modern science is only just beginning to grasp. The references to the need to make the two one can be interpreted as instructions for transcending the basic duality between observer and observed that characterizes ordinary consciousness. The most controversial elements of this text include claims that seem to directly contradict the teachings being codified by the Christian communities that would eventually become the institutional church. While these groups emphasize the importance of faith in Jesus' death and resurrection as specific historical events, the Gospel of Thomas presents a completely different approach where resurrection is understood as a process of spiritual awakening that can be experienced in this life by anyone dedicated enough to the practice. The social and political dimension of these teachings was equally radical. In an era where societies were strictly stratified by class, gender, and ethnic origin, the words preserved in this gospel suggest a fundamental equality among all human beings based on their shared spiritual potential. Specific references to female figures like Mary Magdalene in positions of spiritual authority would have been particularly provocative in the social context of the time, where religious traditions, both Jewish and Greek, tended to exclude women from spiritual leadership roles. The language used to describe advanced states of consciousness in this gospel demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of psychological phenomena that Western science didn't begin to systematically study until the 20th century. The descriptions of experiences where the ordinary perception of time and space transforms correspond with remarkable precision to what contemporary researchers have documented in studies of altered states of consciousness achieved through deep meditation, mystical contemplation, or controlled psychedelic experiences. The specific techniques described in this gospel for cultivating these extraordinary states of consciousness reveal a deep empirical knowledge about the mechanisms of human psychological transformation. The logion that instruct on the importance of observing one's thoughts without fully identifying with them anticipate by centuries the fundamental principles of what we now know as mindfulness or present moment awareness. These practices weren't presented as merely intellectual exercises, but as specific spiritual technologies for dismantling the automatic patterns of thought and behavior that keep people trapped in cycles of suffering and confusion. The psychological precision of these instructions becomes evident when compared to these findings align with contemporary research on neuroplasticity and the modification of brain patterns through contemplative practices. The historical context in which these teachings were preserved adds additional layers of meaning that cannot be ignored when trying to grasp their true scope. During the early centuries of Christianity, multiple interpretive currents vied to define the nature and meaning of Jesus' teachings. The groups that would eventually form the institutional church had both spiritual and political motivations to emphasize certain aspects of these teachings while downplaying or suppressing others. The political dimension of this selection becomes clear when considering that a gospel emphasizing each individual's inherent capacity for direct access to elevated states of consciousness necessarily threatened the authority of any institution, claiming to be the exclusive intermediary between humans and the divine. Early church leaders weren't just preserving spiritual teachings, they were building a power structure that demanded institutional dependency to function effectively. The theological sophistication of the Gospel of Thomas is especially revealed in its treatment of concepts that Eastern spiritual traditions have explored for millennia, but which were relatively unknown in the Judeo-Hellenistic context of the era. References to the unification of opposites, the transcendence of subject-object duality, and the direct realization of non-ordinary states of consciousness demonstrate a mature understanding of universal spiritual principles transcending specific cultural limitations. This universality suggests that Jesus' original teachings may have included elements of wisdom that resonated with contemplative traditions from other cultures, a possibility that would explain why certain aspects of these texts were deemed problematic by communities eager to maintain clear distinctions between Christianity and other spiritual traditions. If you're starting to see connections you hadn't noticed before between these ancient teachings and your own personal growth journey, I'd love to hear your perspective in the comments. Have you ever experienced moments in your life where you felt you could tap into a different kind of understanding or clarity? Share your experience below, because these conversations help us all delve deeper into these mysteries together. The most radical elements of this gospel include assertions suggesting that spiritual enlightenment or awakening isn't some future event to be awaited, but a present potential that can be actualized through specific practices and shifts in perception. This perspective represents a fundamental democratization of spiritual development that eliminates the need for complex systems of institutional mediation. The instructions preserved in these texts indicate that anyone, regardless of social position, formal education, or religious affiliation, can undertake the inner work necessary to directly experience the states of consciousness that characterize spiritual awakening. This universal accessibility would have been perceived as an existential threat by institutions that relied on their role as exclusive intermediaries between individuals and authentic spiritual experience. The specific techniques described for working with problematic emotional and mental states demonstrate a sophisticated understanding of what we now recognize as fundamental psychotherapeutic principles. Instructions on observing thoughts and emotions without resistance or excessive identification correspond precisely with contemporary therapeutic approaches that have proven effective in treating anxiety, depression, and trauma. The ancient wisdom preserved in this gospel suggests that these techniques aren't modern innovations, but rather rediscoveries of universal principles about the functioning of human consciousness that have been known and applied for millennia in diverse contemplative traditions. This gospel's treatment of death reveals another dimension of its theological radicalism. Whereas institutional interpretations of Christianity emphasize the importance of Jesus' physical death as a historical salvific event, this text presents death as a transformation of consciousness that can be experienced and transcended in this life. References to dying before you die aren't poetic metaphors, but precise descriptions of psychological processes where the egoic identifications that typically define personal experience temporarily dissolve, allowing access to broader, more unified states of consciousness. This understanding of death as psychological transformation rather than a final biological event represents a complete paradigm shift in the comprehension of what spiritual salvation or liberation means. The political and social dimensions of these teachings extended far beyond immediate religious matters. In societies where social stratification was considered part of the divine natural order, assertions of fundamental spiritual equality represented a radical critique of existing power structures. Specific references to the spiritual importance of marginalized figures, including women, the poor, and the socially excluded, suggested that spiritual worth didn't align with conventional social status. This egalitarian perspective would have been perceived as subversive by both religious and political elites, who relied on the maintenance of strict social hierarchies to preserve their authority. The preservation of these texts through centuries of persecution and suppression attests both to their inherent spiritual power and to certain groups' recognition that they contained essential elements of the original teachings that shouldn't be lost. Communities that risked their safety to copy and hide these manuscripts understood they were preserving more than just historical documents. They were keeping alive an understanding of human spirituality that offered real alternatives to the systems of religious control emerging as dominant. Their persistence through periods of systematic destruction suggests they met genuine human spiritual needs that weren't being addressed by the institutional interpretations that became orthodox. The institutional interpretation that ultimately prevailed deliberately constructed barriers between direct spiritual experience and mediated religious authority. While these ancient texts presented enlightenment as an immediate possibility accessible to any sincere individual, the emerging structures emphasize the need for specialized intermediaries, complex rituals, and elaborate doctrinal systems. This transformation wasn't accidental, but strategic, designed to create spiritual dependency that would strengthen institutional control. The original teachings that suggested each person could directly access divine truth represented an existential threat to organizations that based their authority on claiming to be the sole valid channels to the sacred. The systematic suppression of these alternative texts allowed for the development of historical narratives that presented the institutional version as the only authentic form of early Christianity. The most radical aspects of these teachings included concepts that challenged the very foundations of how societies organized power and authority. References to the inherent divinity in every human being directly contradicted ideologies that justified political and economic domination based on supposed natural differences between human groups. If all individuals possessed the same divine essence and the same potential for spiritual realization, then social hierarchies based on birth, gender, race, or wealth lost their religious legitimation. This egalitarian understanding represented a conceptual revolution that would have fundamentally transformed social relations if it had been widely adopted and implemented in early Christian communities. The specific techniques for accessing expanded states of consciousness described in these texts demonstrate a psychological sophistication that rivals the most advanced developments in contemporary transpersonal psychology. Instructions for observing thoughts without identifying with them, practices for accessing the mental stillness that exists prior to conceptual activity, and methods for recognizing consciousness as the common substrate of all experiences represent inner technologies developed and refined through generations of contemplative practice. These weren't abstract philosophical speculations, but precise maps of inner territories that could be navigated and explored by any individual committed to sincere inner inquiry. The preservation of these techniques in hidden texts ensured that practical knowledge about higher states of human consciousness wasn't completely lost during periods of restrictive religious orthodoxy. The treatment of reality as fundamentally a construction of consciousness that can be transformed through shifts in perception anticipates developments in quantum physics and contemporary neuroscience that suggest conscious observation plays an active role in determining the nature of what we experience as objective reality. Assertions that the phenomenal world arises from collective and individual mental projections resonate with modern theories about how the brain constructs perceptual experience through complex interpretive processes that filter and organize raw sensory information according to prior expectations and conditioning. This understanding of reality as malleable and consciousness-dependent offered transformative possibilities that threatened social systems based on accepting existing conditions as immutable or divinely ordained. The therapeutic implications of these approaches included methodologies for healing not only individual psychological symptoms, but systemic social pathologies arising from mistaken identifications with roles, status, and artificial separations. References to healing that occurs when people recognize their fundamental unity suggest that many interpersonal and social conflicts are based on distorted perceptions of separation that can be corrected through direct experiences of interconnectedness. This perspective offered real alternatives to cycles of violence and oppression that characterized much of human history, providing conceptual foundations for societies organized according to principles of cooperation and mutual recognition rather than competition and domination. The persistence of elements of these teachings in later mystical traditions, despite official suppression, demonstrates their inherent power to meet authentic human spiritual needs, transcending specific cultural contexts. Medieval Christian mystics, Islamic Sufis, Jewish Kabbalists, and contemplatives from other traditions independently developed practices and understandings that resonated strongly with these ancient texts, suggesting they described universal aspects of human spiritual experience rather than culturally specific beliefs. This convergence among separate traditions indicates that these texts preserve knowledge about the nature of consciousness that naturally emerges when individuals seriously commit to deep inner exploration. The cosmological dimensions of these teachings presented a vision of reality where individual and universal consciousness existed in dynamic continuity rather than absolute separation. Descriptions of multiple levels of reality that interpenetrate and mutually influence each other anticipate contemporary models of complex systems where emergent properties arise from interactions between seemingly separate components. This understanding of reality as fundamentally relational and interdependent contradicted mechanistic conceptions that treated objects, individuals, and institutions as independent entities interacting according to external laws. The holistic vision preserved in these texts offered conceptual frameworks for understanding both personal experience and social phenomena as aspects of broader processes of consciousness evolution and transformation. The practical dimensions of these spiritual teachings extend into concrete methodologies for personal and social transformation that go far beyond abstract philosophical speculation. The texts preserve detailed descriptions of contemplative techniques that enable practitioners to directly experience the states of consciousness that the teachings conceptually describe. These practices didn't focus on forced concentration or thought suppression, but rather on developing a relaxed yet alert attention that allowed for observing mental processes without automatically identifying with their content. The methodology emphasized the importance of recognizing the difference between the observing consciousness and the mental phenomena arising within that consciousness, providing an experiential basis for understanding the teachings on the illusory nature of the separate ego. The instructions on cultivating this quality of attention included warnings about common pitfalls where practitioners confuse temporary altered states with permanent realizations, or where they use practices to reinforce feelings of spiritual superiority rather than to develop genuine humility and compassion. The social applications of these principles manifested in communities that organized their structures according to ideals of reciprocity and mutual support rather than traditional power hierarchies. Historical descriptions of these communities reveal innovative social experiments where decision-making occurred through consensual processes that honored both individual wisdom and emergent collective intelligence. The members of these communities developed ways to resolve conflicts that focused on understanding the underlying needs of all parties involved, rather than determining who was right or who deserved punishment. This approach to conflict was based on the understanding that most disagreements arose from limited perceptions or misunderstandings rather than fundamental, irreconcilable differences between people. Specific methodologies included deep listening practices where participants in a conflict committed to fully understanding the other's perspective before expressing their own viewpoints, creating spaces where mutual vulnerability could dissolve the defenses that perpetuated cycles of mutual reactivity. The economic dimension of these teachings presented radical alternatives to systems based on individual accumulation and competition for scarce resources. The principles described in these ancient texts suggested ways to organize economic activity according to the recognition of the fundamental interdependence among all community members and between human communities and the natural systems that sustain them. References to the abundance that emerges when people free themselves from patterns of attachment and hoarding suggest that much of the perceived scarcity results from inefficient distribution rather than actual resource limitations. This perspective included sophisticated understandings about how economic systems based on fear and competition create individual and social psychological pathologies that reduce the collective capacity to solve problems and create shared well-being. The proposed alternatives emphasize the importance of systems where each person's contribution was valued according to their unique capacities rather than their ability to generate monetary profit, creating incentives for the development of diverse human potentials rather than conformity to limited economic roles. The preservation and transmission of these teachings through adverse historical contexts reveals the extraordinary dedication of individuals and communities who recognized their transformative value. Strategies used to keep these traditions alive during periods of persecution included the codification of essential teachings in symbols and narratives that could go unnoticed by hostile authorities while remaining accessible to sincere students who knew the interpretive keys. This need for concealment led to the development of complex esoteric traditions, where knowledge was transmitted through multiple levels of meaning that were revealed gradually according to the student's preparation and dedication. Methods of transmission included the use of art, music, architecture, and rituals that preserved essential elements of the teachings in ways that could survive the destruction of written texts. The persistence of specific motifs and symbols in seemingly unrelated traditions across different cultures and historical periods suggests that these preservation methods were remarkably successful in maintaining authentic lines of transmission despite geographical dispersion and institutional fragmentation. The contemporary implications of these historical discoveries extend into multiple areas of academic research and practical application that are transforming our understanding of both religious history and human potential. Interdisciplinary studies combining archaeology, textual analysis, contemplative neuroscience, and transpersonal psychology are beginning to provide scientific frameworks for understanding phenomena previously considered purely speculative or supernatural. Research into states of consciousness associated with contemplative practices is revealing specific neurological correlates that validate aspects of these ancient teachings regarding the malleable nature of perception and personal identity. Studies on neuronal plasticity demonstrate that sustained practices of meditation and contemplation can produce measurable structural changes in the brain that correspond to improvements in emotional regulation, empathy, and the ability to maintain stable attention amidst distractions. This convergence between ancient wisdom and contemporary research is providing solid foundations for integrating contemplative methodologies into educational, therapeutic, and organizational contexts where they can contribute to solving complex problems that demand both intellectual rigor and deep practical wisdom. Developments in quantum physics and complex systems theory are providing conceptual models that resonate with the holistic and relational views of reality present in these texts. The cosmological dimensions of these teachings, which once appeared purely mystical or poetic, are now finding profound resonance. Descriptions of reality as fundamentally relational and interdependent find parallels in scientific theories concerning quantum entanglement and the emergence of systemic properties, those that cannot be explained by reducing complex systems to their individual components. Studies on consciousness, emerging from cognitive neuroscience and the philosophy of mind, are beginning to tackle questions about the nature of subjective experience that these contemplative traditions have explored for millennia through direct experiential methodologies. Integrating these perspectives contributes to the development of more comprehensive frameworks for understanding both individual experience and collective phenomena, transcending the limitations of both reductionist materialism and disembodied idealism. Practical applications of this emerging synthesis include novel approaches to education that honor intellectual development alongside emotional and spiritual maturation, therapeutic methodologies that address individual symptoms as well as systemic pathologies, and organizational structures capable of adaptively responding to the complexity and constant change characterizing the contemporary world. The relevance of these teachings to contemporary global challenges becomes increasingly evident when we consider issues like climate change, economic inequity, intercultural conflicts, and mental health crises, all demanding fundamental transformations in how human societies organize themselves and relate to natural systems. The perspectives preserved in these ancient texts offer conceptual and methodological frameworks to address these crises in ways that move beyond superficial technical solutions, embracing the shifts in consciousness necessary for sustainable, long-term change. An understanding of the fundamental interdependence between individual and collective well-being provides a foundation for developing policies and practices that can harmonize legitimate human needs with the integrity of the ecological systems sustaining all life on the planet. Conflict resolution methodologies emerging from these traditions offer alternatives to cycles of violence and retribution that have characterized much of human history, providing practical tools for forging lasting peace rooted in justice and mutual understanding rather than the imposition of power. The educational dimension of these teachings presents visions of learning processes that integrate intellectual, emotional, ethical, and spiritual development, preparing individuals to navigate the complexities of the contemporary world with wisdom and compassion. The pedagogical principles implicit in these texts emphasize the importance of cultivating natural curiosity and critical capacity while simultaneously fostering intellectual humility and the ability to learn from direct experience rather than solely relying on external authorities. Described methodologies include collaborative inquiry processes where students and teachers engage together in exploring fundamental questions about the nature of reality and the meaning of human experience. This approach to learning recognizes that authentic wisdom emerges from integrating conceptual knowledge with experiential insight, developed through contemplative practice and ethical application in real-life situations. The benefits of such integral education include graduates prepared not only for professional success but also to contribute meaningfully to collective well-being through their work, relationships, and participation in democratic processes that demand both technical competence and moral maturity. The political implications of these teachings extend to visions of governance capable of transcending the limitations of both authoritarian systems that suppress individual freedom and superficial democratic structures reduced to factional competitions for political power. The principles of social organization preserved in these texts suggest possibilities for participatory forms of governance where collective decisions emerge from processes that honor both individual wisdom and the collective intelligence cultivated when diverse groups sincerely commit to finding solutions that serve the common good. Specific methodologies include consensual decision-making processes that move beyond mere compromise to achieve creative syntheses, integrating seemingly contradictory perspectives into more comprehensive solutions than any single faction could develop independently. This approach to politics demands levels of emotional maturity and contemplative capacity that transcend the automatic reactivity and polarized thinking characterizing much of contemporary political discourse. Potential benefits include policies that can address complex, long-term problems rather than merely reacting to immediate crises, thereby fostering social stability rooted in genuine justice and participation rather than control through fear or information manipulation. The final synthesis emerging from a careful study of these ancient texts and their contemporary implications reveals extraordinary possibilities for human transformation, both individual and collective, possibilities that far exceed what most people consider realistic or even plausible under current circumstances. The teachings preserved in these documents suggest that human beings possess latent capacities for wisdom, compassion, and collaborative creativity. Capacities that have been systematically suppressed by social structures demanding conformity and competition rather than authenticity and cooperation. Unleashing these repressed human potentials could catalyze social transformations that address the root causes of systemic problems, which have persisted throughout human history because attempted solutions have targeted symptoms rather than underlying causes. Understanding the conditioned nature of many limitations people experience as natural or inevitable opens pathways for personal and social healing that might appear miraculous from conventional perspectives, yet represent the normal functioning of human potentials distorted by individual and collective traumas. The contemplative and communal methodologies preserved in these texts offer practical pathways toward realizing these possibilities, paths that don't demand blind faith but rather the courage to explore territories of experience, transcending the limits of conventional socialization. Thank you for engaging with this material.